Hello and welcome to the Political Dispatch, the podcast that explores the big ideas and policies shaping our world.
I'm Lily Mott.
I'm Sid Kurupati.
And I'm Tom Spare. In today's episode, we're marking a moment in history. This episode is called In the Name of Love, 10 Years of Equal Marriage in Ireland. Because on the 22nd of May 2015, Ireland became the first country in the world to legalise same-sex marriage by a public vote. Not by Parliament, not by the legal system, but by the people.
It wasn't just a political event, it marked a shift in social attitudes in Ireland, a moment of joy, of justice, and of reckoning.
And this month, it isn't just Ireland we're talking about. It's also 10 years since the US Supreme Court ruling in Obergefell versus Hodges that recognized equal marriage at a federal level, and 20 years since same-sex civil partnerships were officiated in the United Kingdom.
So how did Ireland, to its roots a conservative and very Catholic country, become one of the most liberal in Europe? And how, in such a short time, what were the events that led to that historic day when equal marriage became legal in Ireland?
One of Ireland's most famous writers and poets, Seamus Heaney, translated the Greek verse, The Cure at Troy. There's a line frequently quoted by President Bill Clinton during the Good Friday peace negotiations between Ireland and Northern Ireland in the late 90s that aptly evokes the historical moment of the vote. Once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up and hope and history rhyme.
In this episode, we want to take you back to 10 years ago, to May 2015. The world was, of course, a very different place.
So, part two, the world in 2015. Donald Trump had yet announced he was running for president. He would do so a month later. Barack Obama was president of the United States. David Cameron's Conservative Party had just won an outright majority in the UK. And the refugee crisis was raging across Europe as Angela Merkel was Chancellor of Germany.
In the cinema world, Paddington had recently been released, as had Avengers Age of Ultron, Mad Max Fury Road, as well as Selma and the first of the 50 Shades of Grey films. Quite an eclectic mix, don't you think?
Yeah, I just wanted you to read 50 Shades of Grey, Sid. It was just entirely selfishly done there.
Thanks, Tom.
You're welcome.
And in the charts this time, maybe less exciting, See You Again by Wiz Khalifa featuring Charlie Puth, Uptown Funk by Mark Ronson featuring Bruno Mars. I feel like this is like really making me feel old. How many years ago was this? 10 years. Trap Queen by Fetty Wap, Sugar by Maroon 5, and Earned It by The Weeknd. That does make me feel old, but
yeah. I have to say that's not my vibe. Apart from Uptown Funk, that was a good one. That was being played everywhere. I mean, within the first, after a few weeks, it was just everywhere. But there we go. In the tech world, we saw the introduction of the Apple Watch and the introduction of Apple Music. Windows 10 was released, and Tesla released its Model X later that summer, which could exceed 250 miles. So it's without a recharge. So it sort of tells us of the time of the tech world. It wasn't like this period isn't as sort of revolutionary as perhaps 5 years earlier, but still important things going on.
So now that we have the context of what was happening 10 years ago, Tom, could you tell us a bit about Ireland's relationship with referendum? Are they frequently used in the country?
Yeah, so when I was doing the research for this topic for an essay during our MA, I discovered this wild stat. In the post-World War II period, only Switzerland and Italy have held more referendums than Ireland. And even Ireland's 1937 constitution was voted in via a referendum.
So as you might imagine, hearing that stat, which absolutely, yeah, that's so interesting. These referendums have brought about massive societal shifts, in some cases entrenching conservative values. Law and society have often come via a referendum vote. Others, like in 2015, have unlocked new freedoms.
Referendums or referenda are high stakes. In the UK, for example, with the Scottish independence referendum or Brexit, or in the US, where referendums have been deciding a woman's right to choose in many states across America. Referendums don't just reflect public opinion, they shape the public discourse. And when the subject is something as personal and as contested as marriage, the stakes aren't just political, they shift social norms.
The fight for LGBTQ plus rights didn't start overnight. It started in the late 70s, largely driven by academics and activists, one of the most notable being David Norris. In 1988, Norris won a landmark ruling from the European Court of Human Rights, ECHR, which called for the ending of 19th century era laws prohibiting homosexuality in Ireland. The ECHR ruling was a bright spark in an otherwise gloomy decade for social change campaigners, and the 1983 referendum protecting the right to life of the unborn passed thanks to an aggressive campaign led by the Catholic Church, followed by a failed 1986 bid by progressive campaigners to introduce divorce to the country. Lots going on in those couple of years. Wow.
Yeah, and demonstrating still the power of the Catholic Church, which we'll talk about in a bit. So, however, as the 20th century came to an end and the 21st century began, the dial began to shift towards more liberal reform. Homosexuality was decriminalised in 1993, divorce was voted in via referendum in 1995, and corporal punishment was ended by referendum in 2001, with civil partnerships for same-sex couples introduced via legislation in 2011. The pace of change was incredible, culminating in the 2015 referendum.
That was pretty rapid. So what led to this speeding up of social change, to switch so abruptly from the dark times of the 1980s to a more liberal Ireland in the 90s and the early noughties?
For most of the 20th century, the political parties of Ireland deferred moral leadership to the Roman Catholic Church, with politicians avoiding key issues like abortion, divorce, and equal marriage during debates and elections. This is because the church played a significant role in shaping Ireland's second constitution, which was approved by the country's initial referendum in 1937.
Even into the 21st century, the church still had an influence over the wider population. For instance, in the 2011 census, 84% of the population identified as Catholic. However, in recent decades, faith in the church has declined dramatically. Attendance to Mass plummeted from 90% in the 1970s to just 30% by 2018.
And the picture is equally stark for trust, too. 51% of Irish people had a great deal of trust in the church in 1981, but by 2008, that had dropped to 20%. This decline is put down to various historical child abuse cases and the moral hypocrisy reported by the media.
In the wake of the church's waning influence, which had sustained the status quo in Irish society for decades, other actors began transforming society. Internally, these included interest groups, campaigners, and independent politicians. Externally, the European Union, or the EU, played an integral part in liberalizing Irish society, which, according to Cardi, saw the country go from one of the poorest to one of the richest countries in Western Europe.
So the shift was in part political, part social, and part economic. The 2011 election saw Europe's most electorally successful party of the 20th century, Fianna Fáil, vote share collapse. A coalition government was formed between Fine Gael and the Labour Party. Labour had been the earliest political party in Ireland to adopt a pro-same-sex marriage position, and same-sex became a key Labour coalition demand.
With Fine Gael hesitant to adopt a position itself, a compromise led to the creation of the Constitutional Convention. The convention became the arena where same-sex would be debated, in this case by a mix of legislators from both the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, and a randomly selected group of Irish citizens. The convention deliberated on a wide range of issues, generating 40 recommendations, 18 of which required constitutional attention.
And when 79% of that group recommended a referendum on equal marriage, the government responded.
It was a turning point. The decision wasn't imposed from above, it was demanded from below, then legitimised through deliberation. That gave the campaign a foundation of democratic trust, and it helped it transcend traditional party lines.
Ireland's party system did offer the church strong institutional allies. When the public opinion shifted, there was little political resistance left. The church, once central to Irish politics, had lost its hold, and that created a space, politically and culturally, for the conversation to change.
So when thinking about the campaign itself, before the campaign had even formed, Yes received two remarkable endorsements. Father Martin Dolan addressed his Dublin congregation in early January 2015. He declared both his support for same-sex marriage and came out as gay, which was met by a standing ovation, creating a news story that reached media outlets around the world.
2 weeks later, Leo Varadkar, the Minister for Health, went on RTE radio to discuss equal marriage, and he came out live on air.
The Yes campaign was led by an umbrella group known as Yes Equality, with support from community groups as well as international organizations like Amnesty International, professional associations like the Law Society of Ireland, and Twitter. The campaign had a simple message: a vote for same-sex marriage was an equality vote for all.
Campaigners were also keen on focusing on the wider electorate, not just the LGBTQ plus community. A Yes Equality bus toured all of the main urban areas of Ireland, funded by crowdfunding appeals. A voter registration drive before the referendum garnered 60,000 extra registrations, and mentions of the registration drive reached an estimated 6 million Irish Twitter users within 3 weeks of its launch.
The Yes campaign placed LGBTQ plus stories at the centre of their communications, deploying a multifaceted media approach dominated by Twitter and Facebook. And it almost already feels sort of aged in the sense that we're talking about Twitter and talking about Facebook as well, although both, X still has a part to play and Facebook as well. And this was before, I don't know when Meta was announced, actually. It was some time after this. So it was still when it was just Facebook. Yes deployed a hashtag home to vote Twitter campaign that was mentioned 72,000 times on voting day. The campaign was backed by the majority of political parties, but most politicians played largely marginal roles, with the exception of Leo Varadkar and longtime campaigner turned politician David Norris.
The No campaign did not, however, have as diverse a support base as Yes. Instead, the campaign was driven largely by a Catholic-led coalition of religious groups with the support of the Iona Institute. The Catholic Church played a limited role in comparison to previous referendum, but the Primate of all Ireland, Eamon Martin, publicly denounced same-sex marriage, a message repeated to congregations across Ireland. The No campaign focused on traditional television broadcasts, but did invest heavily in YouTube adverts, which stood outside of the political advertising regulations.
A central tenet of the No campaign's messaging focused on surrogacy and adoption, with a poster campaign including the tagline, "Every child deserves a father and a mother." Quote, quote, quote. This messaging was inspired by earlier polling that indicated, even amongst Yes supporters, 40% of voters had reservations about adoption by same-sex couples.
And also alongside that, because the government was aware that the adoption discussion might detract from the vote itself, they actually passed a separate legislation which quickened the ability for same-sex couples to adopt. So they sort of preempted it. So I think that's why it wasn't entirely derailed by that. I think if they'd had perhaps gone a different way, it might have switched it, because even though there's been all this liberal change, very quick liberal change, there's still quite conservative values towards the convention of a family and what makes a family. Polling narrowed in the weeks leading up to the vote, but not enough to overturn the result. It did seem that pollsters had overestimated the Yes vote's popularity over No by at least sort of 7%.
And on Friday, 22nd May, Ireland voted 62.07% in favor of equal marriage, with 37.93% against, on a turnout of 60.52%, becoming the first country in the world to enshrine same-sex marriage into a constitution via a public vote.
Every single constituency voted yes, with the exception of Roscommon South Leitrim, with the highest concentration of yes votes in Dublin and the surrounding areas. But Ireland's referendum wasn't just a domestic event, it echoed around the world. Within weeks, the US Supreme Court ruled in favor of equal marriage in Obergefell versus Hodges.
And that same year, Scotland followed suit. England and Wales had legalized equal marriage the year before. Northern Ireland came later, not until 2020.
And again, Northern Ireland's traditionally pretty conservative as well. Globally, over 30 countries now recognise same-sex marriage, but the picture is uneven. In Eastern Europe, LGBTQ plus rights are under threat. In parts of Africa and the Middle East, same-sex relationships remain criminalised. And in the US, the backlash has shifted to focus on trans rights and education.
And in the UK as well, might we add?
Yeah, well, exactly, yeah. With the
I'll be a little bit defensive here, but
yeah. With the recent decision by the Supreme Court in the UK,
yeah. The question becomes, how do we protect progress? What keeps equality alive when the spotlight fades?
So what does it look like 10 years later? Has Ireland lived up to that promise of equality?
There's certainly a lot to be proud of. In the decade since the vote, Ireland elected its first openly gay Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar. Representation has improved in politics, entertainment and education. Pride is now celebrated across every county.
But the work isn't over. As we alluded to before, activists have turned their attention to conversion therapy bans, transgender healthcare access, and LGBTQ plus inclusive sex education in schools. And many are calling for more intersectional approaches that support queer migrants, disabled people, and working class LGBTQ plus communities.
The legacy of 2015 is also under quiet threat. Rights won aren't always rights protected. The closure of some LGBTQ plus community centres and the strain on mental health services show that visibility isn't the same as investment.
Absolutely. And globally, the picture is mixed. Taiwan became the first country in Asia to legalize equal marriage in 2019. Chile followed in 2022. But elsewhere, we've seen sharp reversals. Hungary passed laws banning LGBTQ plus content in education and media. Uganda passed one of the harshest anti-LGBTQ plus laws in the world in 2023. And might I add, in India, there was a case that was filed in the Supreme Court, public interest litigation, as we call it, to legalize equal marriage. But the court decided to strike down the public interest litigation in favor of the government, and basically said that this is more of a legislative role rather than something that the courts need to decide, and kind of pass the buck to the government. However, it was one of the first cases that was live streamed in India to watch, and it became quite an experience to kind of know how the Supreme Court actually functions. And lastly, in the US and the UK, trans rights have become part of a larger culture war.
Progress has never been easy, but what 2015 taught us is that real change doesn't come from the top down. It comes when people speak with courage and authenticity about their life and their rights. They build broad coalitions and they take advantage of changing social attitudes.
And that's one of the most powerful lessons from all of this, that democracy, which at times can be incredibly messy, can still surprise us. People can still come together and vote for a better tomorrow.
And what are your guys' thoughts on this moment in rights for LGBTQ plus people around the world? It can be in the US, it can be in the UK. Sid, you talked a little bit about India. What are your thoughts on how we've changed, where we're at from the history that we just went over? Where are we now?
Well, yeah, because the weird thing I find with, first of all, haven't politicians got something better to do than target very vulnerable, or not even very vulnerable people, but people that just want to get on with their lives, that is in actuality a small part of the population globally. Obviously, we don't know full numbers, and there's probably a lot more trans people out there than we realize, because data monitoring, you're not obliged to say if you're trans, and also that comes at a massive risk as well. You could become the target of sort of ill feeling, or targeted legal reasons and so on. And there's so much more things going on, that our climate crisis, conflict and war, than targeting a particular part of society that just want to exist. And it's not like it's an easy life to live either. So when I think about this, it makes me quite sad, because it was like a really big high point of 2015 was actually an incredibly big year for LGBTQ plus community. But I guess it's sort of the swing of sort of public opinion has changed quite a lot in that time, and lots of things have happened since.
I think the last 10 years, the world's changed drastically. Technology has changed drastically, which sort of circles back to how we started, the throwback to 2015. Twitter is not Twitter anymore. It's owned and controlled by Elon Musk, who is known for his strong opinions and strong points of political viewpoints. And the number of governments which have shifted to the populist right has also changed. And the populist right, or the conservative, largely have always had a more reserved opinion on equal marriage and same-sex marriage, or LGBTQ plus rights. So I'm not surprised that we're in this situation today, where people from the community are back under scrutiny. In politics and policy, there is a concept called the Overton window, which tells you the acceptability. It gives you a range of acceptability of ideas and things that the government can do or can't do, or should do or should not. That's just a sort of a nutshell kind of an explanation. And it has shrunk since 2015, I believe. That's coinciding with the far right, or the populist right, which is there across major democracies at this point in time. So maybe it's a phase. Maybe it's a phase that we're in right now, and it should sort of change again as time progresses, and the focus would be on the real issues rather than telling people how they should live and who they can marry and who they should love. And I think till that happens, I think, yes, Tom, you're right. It is very sad. It's also very discouraging for people who actually support the LGBT community, who are not part of the community but support the community, for them to also even see something like this. So I completely echo your thoughts.
So it's interesting. I'll give like a very brief overview of my dissertation that I actually did at Cardiff, because this is very connected to this moment and just what's going on in the UK in particular. But I did my dissertation on Mumsnet and the prevalence of gender critical feminist discourse on Mumsnet, which is J.K. Rowling's position on trans rights, where it essentially calls for the distinction between gender and sex. And one of the main points is that biological women should be treated differently from trans identifying women and should have women only spaces. There's a lot of other points around that, but that's pretty much like the J.K. Rowling perspective of it, because of, again, there's lots more to dissect with this, but because of the danger that trans identifying women could pose to biological women, this is all like in quotation marks. I know we're on a podcast, so you can't see it, but that's essentially the positioning, in that biological women have different biological needs and have different biology just in general. So really interesting, like, to dive into and to see the conversations that happen around gender critical feminism. And I studied that for 6 months, just like combing through Mumsnet posts, which has become a forum that is widely used for TERFs. That's kind of like for some considered a slur, but it means trans exclusionary radical feminists. They actually have kind of adopted it as their own vernacular, and they've kind of like owned it. So it's kind of it depends on who you ask as far as the language around it. But I think it's really frustrating because I actually chose to do that topic because I thought it was really interesting to see how an issue like trans rights, which is incredibly sensitive and it does impact so many people, could just openly be talked about in a very hateful way online. And I wanted to see how the content moderation policies were being adapted based on those conversations. And I think that it's a really interesting case study. I think that trans rights are one. I think immigration is another right now at this point around the world where it's really distracting from other parts. Like these issues are cultural issues and they're meant to be divisive and they're being used by politicians to distract from other things that might be happening in governments around the world. And I think that that's incredibly sad and very frustrating for so many people. Just to echo what Tom and Sid have really already said. But I think that it's these talking points and these headlines that are captivating attention from really serious things that might be being passed or that might be happening behind the scenes. And it's just drawing attention because people do want to talk about these things. I think that a lot of times they're inflated to be a much bigger problem than they might be. And I think it's like you were saying, Tom, this is a very small population of people around the world who do deal with many challenges. I think that's a big issue that trans rights activists constantly talk about when it comes to gender critical feminism, for example, is trans identifying women and trans identifying men face so many challenges in their day-to-day life just existing. So I think just reminding everyone of that, and I think it's just that empathy piece. I think, Sid, we can also relate. I know I'm bringing up immigration and trans rights, which are entirely different issues, impact entirely different people, and I think, are being used in different contexts. But people who are dealing with these issues and who might identify as these different groups who are being targeted, it's really hard to live in the world and see these headlines. And I think for me, it's also just frustrating to see that this is what we're focusing on in the news and this is what our politicians are focusing on, because I feel like there is so much more going on that we should be paying attention to and that should be being talked about. But that's my take. That's a very kind of long roundabout way of saying I'm also sad and frustrated like you guys, just to echo you both. Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's good that we're doing this episode to give a look at the history of LGBTQ plus rights. And I think ending on a positive note that there is hope and there's definitely ways to work towards better tomorrow. That's voting and that's other forms of grassroots activism, that's having conversations, that's listening to podcasts like this, that's finding resources to educate yourself. There's lots of different ways.
Yeah, 100%. And the cynic in me often thinks that are politicians focusing on these topics because they know that they're not capable themselves of dealing with the other things that are happening. And I just feel that because the political system is shaped in a particular way. I've been writing about this because, I'm going to write in a couple of weeks about Keir Starmer's Island of Strangers comment that he made in a speech. And I think the problem with politics is that we have a generation of massive overachievers, but also underachievers. So they're overachievers in how quickly they come into politics now. So if we think about Rishi Sunak, how quickly he went from being an MP to being Prime Minister, and the same with Keir Starmer, but also massive underachievers that they're not passing the legislation, the historic legislation, or making the big political moments that previous generations have been able to do because they're more focused on winning the headlines, filling the comms grid, not saying things, and actually not really being that authentic or not being sort of honest with the voters to say, well, the world is not a straightforward place. It's never been a straightforward place. But now, because everyone knows lots more, you're clicks away from understanding what's going on in different parts of the world. It's all very overwhelming. Yeah, that's just sort of my thoughts on it, that we have a generation of politicians that lack courage and imagination to resolve and to tackle some of our biggest challenges.
Yeah, I think that's a fairly valid point to make. And just to add on to that, I think it also, I wouldn't say in the UK, but I think in a few other democracies which have populist right governments right now in power, dabbling in telling people what they should be doing, who they should be with, and if they can marry someone or not, is essentially the way of controlling, the population. And it is a messaging, it is a stance that appeals with their core voters. So in a sense, it helps them stay in power. And it kind of boils down to that, when you're able to tell an entire population of a country some of the most personal things that they can do, and you have a large section of the population that actually supports you and continues to elect you to power, it is a validation of this sort of thought process, and not the thought process that everyone is equal. And it has to reach a saturation point where the larger population, the population that is actually supporting the government, starts getting affected by the same government because of their own rules. And when that happens, when that saturation point happens, that's when the winds of power shift. They start blowing in the opposite direction. And, there are a few cracks here and there in some of these populist right governments. And I think we're not too far away from, a new phase emerging, and doing an episode 10 years later and discussing how things were in this 10 years and, how it shifted again. What do you think?
I think really interesting point said. I think that idea of asserting power over people's most kind of vulnerable choices and their most personal choices is really interesting. I think that's something that I hadn't really thought about, but that makes a lot of sense. I think you could tie that into marriage rights, you can tie that into gender identity, abortion, healthcare. I think there's so many things like that where that's really interesting. It might not be like the most conscious choice by people, but I think there's definitely like a subconscious piece to that. If it's not at the forefront of their minds, it's definitely there somewhere. I think that's really interesting. But Tom, what were you going to say?
Yeah, and I also think for the women in Scotland in particular, I get the arguments that are being made, because this is where the UK Supreme Court decision was as a result of the Scottish government going to court about a decision about the identity of women in prisons, because there'd been a particularly complicated case with a trans woman. And but it is so very, very unlikely that what was being described would happen again and again. We're talking about someone going through the transitioning to be a woman to target other women. That's a very extreme example, and it's not helpful. And ultimately, it will not help women. It will not protect women, because definitions like this bring up other discussions about things like abortion, women's right to choose. And it is a dangerous path to go down when you start separating everyone, and you can do these things and you can't. And not far away from that argument is, well, women should be at home and men should be at work, and men should have control over people's finances and all of that sort of stuff. And although that seems like counterproductive, I see that direct line, particularly if you get more right-wing people in government. They'll use those same tools that were meant to protect people to abuse the system and switch it. So we do have the Scottish elections next year, and we do have the Welsh elections as well. Again, it'll be interesting to see how the parties operate, really, and who is successful. The assessment a lot of people are making at the moment is that Plaid Cymru are going to do very well in Wales. So the sort of Welsh nationalist, so the equivalent of the SNP, a bit more sort of leftist, I suppose, than the SNP, because the SNP have oddly become a bit more conservative with a small c. And Reform are going to do very well in Wales, even though Reform doesn't have a leader in Wales. It's still Nigel Farage is the UK leader, who can't run in the Senedd elections because he's not registered in Wales. So although he's on ITV saying, we'll stop Wales becoming a country of sanctuary and things like that. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see if that's replicated in Scotland, whether Reform do well there. Yeah, but also I think the rise of the right in the UK is probably more overblown, and people are giving Nigel Farage more credit than he deserves, and that For example, in the local election results, which happened a few weeks ago, that everyone was making out as if Reform were going to be in Downing Street by Christmas. The reality is that they've got 800 seats, or just over 800 seats out of 17,000. They are pretty much exactly the same number as the Green Party, but no one's talking about a green revolution in England. They're talking about reform. And we're giving far too much oxygen for people who don't care about people in Wales or in England or Scotland and Northern Ireland. They just care about themselves. And they're not doing it for the public good. And they're giving very easy answers to very, very difficult questions. So, yeah, and that's worrying. And they'll just take advantage of this court ruling, and they will make a load of other quite conservative positions, which will put us back quite a long way. And people need to wake up to that. And I don't get this whole blokey thing. Oh, it's great. It's a good laugh. Well, I mean, your friends that you knew from years ago that were a good laugh and, you're chummy with, and, is he reliable? Will he stand up for you? Will he help your family? Will he get you a job? No. He'll leave you destitute. He will take everything from you, and he'll be grinning at the end.
That was like a mic drop. I don't know what else to add. Do you have anything to say?
Yeah, no, that was, I think Lily put it perfectly. That was a mic drop moment. And, I think this entire episode has kind of reminded me of a particular scene from The West Wing. It's that scene where he is talking to a alt-right conservative group, and, and the lady who's there and who comes to visit the president in the White House along with her companions talks about how the Bible, doesn't allow you to do this and doesn't allow you to recognize, I think, homosexuality. And then, she quotes the Leviticus verses, and he's like, chapter and verse, something like that, Martin Sheen. And he gives multiple other examples showing the hypocrisy of why you cite the Bible for this, but you don't cite the Bible for so many other things, such as, touching the skin of a dead pig, or growing, multiple crops in the same zone, and so on and so forth. So, there's just the source that's being used to cite their validity of their decision making also has a lot of, examples which are not practiced anymore by the same group. So I think the hypocrisy of it all is ridiculous. Yeah, I think we're going to see a future that is going to be much better, and which has hope for every community, and a world that is far more accepting than dividing, and recognizing each other as a human being first than anything else as an identity, be it your sexuality, be it your religion, be it your caste, or be it your gender. You're human first. Treat each other with respect and love. And Musk will not have to take us to Mars. We can make this a better place.
Yeah, it's true. Because help isn't on the way. We're the only ones that can do it.
Okay. And that's all for us this week. You can find us wherever you found this episode. Please like, subscribe, and share our show so we can reach more people and drive up interest in the podcast. My name is Lily Mott.
And I'm Tom Spare.
And I'm Sid Kurapati. You've been listening to the Political Dispatch.